Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Hi, my name is Matthew Bell, and I'm the president of the Federalist Society.
My name is Brooke McLean, and I'm president of the Health Law Society.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We have an awesome event today, a friendly debate between two amazing speakers. And I'll let Brooke begin, and I'll...
So I'm actually going to start by introducing Mark Britton, and we had a funny moment earlier. I said, "Is your wife's name Jennifer?" And I've actually heard about Mark for years, first from your nephew. It's not true. And they always said, "Oh, you're really," because I was that kid in undergrad pre-med that was like, "Oh, I'm really interested in like science and the law," and they kept saying, "Oh, you should reach out to my Uncle Mark. You should keep," and I should have done it sooner, so that's my fault. But Mark graduated with a BA in history and minor in chemistry from the U, but we'll forgive him for that because then he graduated from UAU Law School, so he is an alum of our great institution. He then went and served as counsel to the Banking and Judiciary Committees at the U.S. House of Representatives for 4 years, before moving to Capital One as a senior business analyst. He then served at the Privacy Office and the IRB at University of Utah. For those of you who are unfamiliar with what those offices do, it approves a lot of human research and a lot of, oh, is this what we should be doing with scientific studies? He also was the director of Multiling Corporation, which deals with foreign patent filings. And then he served most recently, since 2006, as general counsel and director of government affairs for the Utah Medical Association. We're happy to have him.
And our speaker today, our other speaker today is Christina Sandefur, who's a graduate from Hillsdale College and then from Michigan State University College of Law. Christina is the executive vice president at the Goldwater Institute. She also develops policies and litigates cases advancing healthcare freedom, free enterprise, private property rights, free speech, and taxpayer rights. Christina has won important victories for property rights in Arizona and works nationally to promote the Institute's Private Property Rights Protection Act, state-level reform that requires government to pay owners when regulations destroy property rights and reduce property value. She's also a co-drafter of the 40-state Right to Try initiative, now federal law, which protects terminally ill patients' right to try safe investigational treatments that have been prescribed by their physician but are not yet FDA approved for market, which we'll talk more about today. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
All right, great. Well, thank you all for coming out. I was just saying beforehand that I like to think that you're all here because you want to have a really great, robust discussion about healthcare and medical autonomy, but I'm guessing that some of you are here because they had some really excellent food items outside. So we won't ask you to raise your hands and say who represents which. Before I get started, I just wanted to say that this is a topic that is so immense that we could probably talk about it for hours and hours and days and days. And so by the nature of giving a less than an hour talk or having less than an hour conversation, we're not going to be able to get in really in depth into some of the things that we're going to want to talk about. Some of these things might seem a little oversimplified. It's really, really difficult to go too in depth into these topics in a short amount of time. But just know that there are lots of perspectives out there. There are lots of more in-depth analyses that are out there, and there's a law review article that I wrote and that you can find on the Goldwater Institute's website, also on the SSRN website, although I'm told now, for those of you familiar with SSRN, that you need to have a password to go on and get people's articles, so that's disappointing. If you can't find the article and you want to know more about the issue, please feel free to email me, to tweet or Facebook, or send up a smoke signal or whatever people do these days, and I'll make sure you get the article. So let's start by talking about a couple of examples. I want to start by talking about a young man named Diego Morris. Diego Morris, about 6 years ago, was diagnosed with osteosarcoma when he was only 10 years old. That is a rare form of bone cancer, and it can be fatal in about a third of all of the people that it affects. Now, Diego was otherwise healthy, and that was, as you can imagine, a devastating diagnosis for Diego and his family to receive. But Diego's parents were confident that they could find something that they could do to help their child, and they asked the doctor, "What treatment options do we have available?" Diego's doctor said, "Well, there's chemotherapy, but unfortunately, in these cases, it's not always very effective. And if it is effective, given Diego's age, it's very likely that the osteosarcoma could come back, and when it comes back, it may not be treatable at that point. That really wasn't sufficient for Diego's mother, and she pressed on and she said, are there no other treatment options out there for our son? He's young, he's healthy, he wants to go out and play soccer, and this is really affecting his life and also his leg, which is a big deal when he wants to be a star soccer player. And the doctor said, well, actually, there is a very effective treatment for osteosarcoma and for kids in Diego's situation, and it's available in countries outside of the United States, but it's not available here in the United States. Has not yet been approved by the Federal Food and Drug Administration, and so I can't offer that to Diego. Well, Diego's mother was shocked to hear that, and after she recovered from that shock, she had to have a very difficult discussion with her husband about their family. Diego's family made a very difficult decision to not only pick up and travel to Europe, but actually to move to England for an entire year so that Diego could get the life-saving treatment that he needed. Diego's story actually has a happy ending because the treatment was successful. After a year, he was able to come back to the United States. He graduated high school, and he's now in college. In fact, he interned at the Goldwater Institute, where I work, where we worked on on the right to try laws. And he said, although he's still holding out to be a star soccer player, in the meantime, he wants to help people in his own country to make sure that they can get access to medicines that he was not able to get access to unless he traveled outside of the U.S. Diego told me that he was fortunate because his family had the means to be able to pick up and leave the United States and go to another country. In fact, he used to joke to his classmates that his father had the longest commute to work out of any of them because he was commuting from London to Phoenix. But Diego knows that most people don't have the luxury to pick up and move to another country to get life-saving treatment. Now, we wonder why people are put in situations like that, especially because America is so free, our rights are so protected here that we're able to be innovative, we're able to be entrepreneurial. In fact, people develop drugs and treatments here in the United States and even produce them here in the United States because we are so free, because our rights are so well protected. So why is it that people aren't able to avail themselves of those treatments that could possibly prolong or even save their lives? Well, some people will say, look, there are other options for people like Diego. For example, there's the clinical trial process. This is going to be an oversimplification, of course, given time constraints, but the clinical trial process is the way that we test many drugs and treatments. It's what the FDA uses to test these treatments before it gives final market approval. The clinical trial process is about 3 or 4 phases, and it tests not just for safety, but also for efficacy, to test whether or not that drug is effective and whether it's going to work in a number of different situations that the FDA deems necessary before it will approve it for sale on the market. That process is extremely lengthy. It can take on average about 14 years before a potentially life-saving treatment is available to market. Now think about that, 14 years. You all probably have one of these. Hopefully it's in your pocket and not out in front of you, right? Because you're so enamored and immersed in what it is that I'm saying. But how old is your cell phone? A couple of years? Probably if it's 3 or 4 years, you're thinking it's time to trade up, right? We rely on this technology to do just about everything for us. Can you imagine using 14-year-old technology in order to try to answer your emails or, get where you're trying to go, keep your schedule? Nobody would do that, right? Technology is developing so quickly. Can you imagine now if you are diagnosed with a terminal illness and you're told that there are treatment options that could help you, that are still working their way through the regulatory pipeline, that are being tested for efficacy. They're not just being tested for safety, but for efficacy, for whether or not they're effective. They could be effective for you, we don't know, but you're not allowed to even try because the FDA says so. That would be extremely upsetting to you. Well, that's the situation that we have today. Now, in that clinical trial process, of course, people are able to enroll in the clinical trial, and people like Diego can can volunteer and enroll in the trial so that they can receive the medications and they can be tested on. And those medications can be tested, they can be part of that process. Unfortunately, only 3% of all terminal patients actually are accepted into clinical trials. Clinical trials are scientific studies, and by the way, clinical trials are very important scientific studies, and this is not at all to diminish the importance of clinical trials in a number of different situations. But by their very nature, because they are scientific studies, we need very, very specific candidates to be admitted to those trials because we might be testing the drug and how it affects a particular patient at a particular time in their disease, or who doesn't manifest other side effects or things like that. And so oftentimes the sickest people are actually excluded from clinical trials. They're too sick. By the time they get into the clinical trial, they're not going to yield the data that's needed, and they might actually pass away before the trial is over. Ironically, sometimes people who are too well for clinical trials, and so they're also excluded. I'll give you an example of that. A woman named Jen McNary had 2 boys that were diagnosed with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. It's a degenerative muscular disease that is fatal among boys, usually at a very young age. She wanted to enroll her boys in a very promising clinical trial for a treatment that has actually since been approved by the FDA, but at the time it wasn't. So she went to enroll in the clinical trial, and her sons were about 3 years apart. Her youngest son was still able to walk, he was able to get around, he was able to go out and play with his friends. He was just starting to show symptoms, and he was admitted into the clinical trial. Her older son was not able to walk completely throughout the day. He was starting to show symptoms of his disease, and unfortunately he was not admitted to the clinical trial because that particular trial was testing the effects of the drug on boys who were still ambulatory, boys who were still able to get around and walk and run and do things like that. And so Jen McNary had to witness something that no mother should ever have to witness. She had to watch as one of her sons was given the treatment and got better and was able to go out and play with his friends and live a fairly normal life, while another one of her sons got worse and worse to the point where he was wheelchair-bound, not able to feed or clothe himself, and his younger brother actually had to help him take care of himself. This is the outcome of a system that means well, but is fundamentally unfair. Now, why do we have to travel overseas to get access to these medications? Why do you have to be asked to contribute, frankly, to a science experiment in order to get access to life-saving treatments? Well, it's because in the United States, in the land of the free, where our fundamental rights are supposed to be protected, we have to get government permission before we can take any kind of medication. Some of this permission has been waived, right? If I want to go get Tylenol, I can just go down and get that off the pharmacy shelves, but that's because the government told me that I could do that. In the United States, the land of the free, you have to get government permission to try to save your own life. Now, at the Goldwater Institute, we took a look at that and we said, let's go back to first principles, right? You're in law school, you've all read your Constitution. In fact, you've all got your pocket constitutions on you, right? Read it cover to cover. A person owns her own life. And if you own your own life, then the right to medical autonomy, the right to make your own medical decisions, especially the right to try to save your own life, that is a fundamental right. And in fact, I would argue that if you don't have that right, exercising any of your other fundamental rights, constitutionally guaranteed rights, well, that's sort of surplusage, right? Because if you can't exercise the right to try to save your own life, those other rights become somewhat meaningless. And so I would argue that it's unethical and also unconstitutional for the government to deny you that right, especially if you are terminally ill, because the terminally ill have a different risk-benefit calculus, right? If you know you're facing a terminal illness and there's nothing you can do about it except that there is a treatment out there that won't kill you, it might not work, it might even have some very serious side effects, but it won't kill you, and you know your illness will, my argument is that you should be able to decide to try that medication, even if it might not work, so long as you are aware of all the risks and you know that there are risks out there that you may not know about. And of course, this is true with anything, right? We talk about risks, and And people in favor of the current system will argue, well, nobody has perfect information. We can't trust patients to make their own decisions because they don't have enough information to do that, especially for drugs that haven't been fully vetted yet. But of course, nobody has perfect information. In fact, a third of all FDA-approved drugs are later recalled or flagged or even removed completely from market due to safety concerns alone, not just efficacy. Because if you think about it, the system that the FDA has itself in place is somewhat arbitrary. They're drawing a line at about 14 or 15 years, right, when they've tested the drug for a certain amount of time, but every individual is different. Every symptom is different, every disease is different, every patient is different. What you are willing to accept, what risks you're willing to take on, and what benefits are worth taking on those risks, those are not scientific questions, those are not medical questions, those are personal judgment questions. And my argument is, if people are armed with information and they know that there are risks out there and they know what they're getting themselves into, they should be able to make that decision for themselves. And no one, not the FDA, not your doctor, not the bureaucrats in Washington, can make that decision for you because they don't know your risk-benefit calculus. Now, even the Supreme Court has acknowledged that you have a constitutionally protected interest in these things, right? And this goes back decades and decades. The Supreme Court has acknowledged that you have a right to refuse life-saving treatment. The court has acknowledged that you have a right to refuse unwanted bodily intrusions, that you have the right to seek out the doctor of your choice. And in fact, many other federal courts have really narrowed down those rights into a number of different circumstances, including what I thought was really interesting, a district court in Alabama that recognized your constitutionally protected right to decide whether or not to cut your own hair. So there's a ton of case law out there protecting people's rights to their own bodily integrity, to make their own decisions for themselves on things that might seem trivial to all of us, cutting our own hair. You should have a fundamental right then to decide to try to save your own life. And in fact, this is an argument that was made about a little over 12 years ago, got all the way up to the DC Circuit. Unfortunately, the United States Supreme Court didn't take that case, but this is sort of the basis of right to try. How many of you have heard about the Abigail Alliance case? Have you studied that in any of your classes? No? Nobody. Great. That means that I can tell you all about it. All right, well, Abigail Burroughs, she was a young woman who was diagnosed with cancer. This was another situation where there was a treatment out there that could potentially help her, but it was still making its way through the clinical trial testing process. She could not get into a clinical trial, even though she otherwise met the criteria, because the clinical trial was for colon cancer, and her cancer manifested in the head and neck. So she, again, was not a proper candidate because she wouldn't help the testers yield the results that they were looking for. Unfortunately, while Abigail tried to get through that regulatory labyrinth, she lost her life. And she passed away, and her father decided that he wanted to keep up her fight because he believed in the right to try to save your own life, and he did not think that Abigail's only options should be to try to get into a clinical trial or to try to beg the FDA for some kind of exception. So they took this case all the way up to federal court, all the way up to the DC Circuit, which you all know is the second highest court in the land. And a 3-judge panel on the DC Circuit said, yes, you do have a fundamental right to try to save your own life. The Due Process Clause guarantees that the terminally ill have a right to use investigational medications that have gotten through phase 1 or the basic safety testing, right? This is the idea that if the FDA says that a treatment or a drug is safe enough to give to human beings in clinical trials, then it should be good enough to give to people outside of clinical trials who also are dying and want to try that treatment. And they also said that not only do we have this long history of the Supreme Court recognizing these medical autonomy rights, but this goes back to common law, right? The common law right to self-defense. You all know, you study that, you have a common law right to defend yourself if your life is at risk. Well, what better example of defending yourself if your life is at risk if there are willing parties and there are treatments out there and the government says you can't try that treatment? No, the Constitution trumps that. That's what the court said. Unfortunately, if that were the end of the line, we wouldn't all be here talking about this topic today. But unfortunately, the FDA petitioned for an en banc rehearing, right? That's when all the judges get together and reconsider the case. And the court reversed at that point. The DC Circuit reversed that original panel. And they said, no, there's no fundamental right to try to save your own life. Instead, what you have is a liberty interest. What the heck is a liberty interest? That's a distinction only a lawyer can love, right? What that means is that you have an interest in trying to save your own life, but we're going to weigh that against whatever the government's interests are in making that decision for you. And the court did that. The court said, we don't think that people, again, have the right to assume these risks, even people who are dying, even people who are desperate and out of options. We don't think they have the right to assume the risks that the FDA has decided they're not allowed to assume. And we think that the appropriate place for that decision to be made is in the democratic branches. This is what happens whenever the court recognizes that you have an interest in something but not a fundamental right, right? For whatever reason, the courts have bifurcated our rights. They've drawn some line on one side, our fundamental rights, that you absolutely have a right to unless the government can give a really, really good reason for why it should be able to take that right away from you. And on the other side are all the liberty interests. And those are interests that you have, but the courts will defer to the government if the government decides that it wants to take those rights away from you or curtail those rights, which of course means that they're not actually really rights, right? That's why the courts call them liberty interests. Well, sadly, the right to try to save your own life was deemed by the DC Circuit to be one of those not rights, but liberty interests. And here Congress had given the FDA authority to regulate, and so the court said, we're going to go with the FDA. But the court did say that the democratic branches could decide to change their minds, and if enough people were interested in trying to protect that right, the right place for them to go would be to the legislature. And that's exactly what we did at the Goldwater Institute. Over the last 4 years, we worked with patients, doctors, and policymakers across the country on a very simple but very important law called the Right to Try Law. And the Right to Try Law says this. It says that if you're diagnosed with a terminal illness, you've exhausted all your government-approved options, you cannot get into a clinical trial, and there is a treatment out there that your doctor thinks would work for you that is past basic safety testing by the FDA, it's being given to people in clinical trials, you have the right to go and try to work with the drug company and get that treatment for yourself. You don't have to go to the FDA and beg them for permission to try to use that treatment. That law, in just 4 short years, passed in 41 states. It was actually introduced in every single state, and it passed in 41 states. What is so amazing about this law is that it passed near unanimously in every state that it passed in, including Utah, by the way, and it wasn't partisan. In some states, it was signed into law by Democratic governors and some Republican governors. Many states had bipartisan co-sponsors. And in a law school, you might wonder, well, how is it that states can pass a law that so clearly conflicts with federal law? And our argument, of course, was going back to this long history of the Supreme Court recognizing the right to medical autonomy and a long history of cases where the Supreme Court has said that, look, states actually have the power to regulate medicine, and states have the power to protect people's rights, and when the federal government fails to protect these rights, and again, this, we are arguing, is a fundamental right, the states can step in and protect the rights the federal government failed to protect, because the federal Constitution provides a floor for the protection of rights, not a ceiling. And that's how 41 states were able to pass this law. Over the last 4 years, hundreds of people from all over the country have been treated under state right to try laws. The FDA has actually reformed some of its, I would argue, very archaic and bureaucratic processes in response to state right to try laws. And just this year, just a few months ago, Congress finally could not ignore the voice of patients and lawmakers and policymakers and doctors all over the country, and they stood up and passed a bipartisan right to try law at the federal level. So now right to try is the law of the land. I'll close with this, and I hope we can get into some more details in rebuttal and during the Q&A, but I want to make very clear that if a right is fundamental, you should never have to go to the legislature, whether it be your state legislators or Congress, in order to beg them to protect that right. You should not have to pass a law in 41 states or a congressional law in order to protect something so fundamental as the right to try to save your own life. But it is very good that we do have that option, and when the courts fail and when the federal government fails to protect our rights, then the people can go to their legislatures, they can go to their state governments, and they can pass these laws, and they can reassert the right, the fundamental right to try to save your own life. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions at the end.
Wow. That was an excellent presentation. I learned a lot. I learned a lot in reading your article. I don't know if this was, I don't know, did I miss it? Was it mentioned? Well, yeah, she mentioned the law review article that she wrote. I kind of reviewed that in preparation for this. It's really fun to be back here. I was here like a million years ago, and I have never actually come back and spoken at the law school here since I graduated a while back. As was mentioned, I was in DC for a while, and so it's really interesting, and then came back to Utah. My work right now as General Counsel and Director of Government Affairs for the Utah Medical Association has nothing to do with courtroom work. I don't do any litigation. I don't represent physicians in court, anything like that. I work on laws. I work with the legislature. I work with the Department of Health. I work with the Department of Commerce that regulates and licenses healthcare providers, physicians in particular, but nurses and everybody else in the healthcare sector. And I actually happen to know somebody who is basically the vice president of safety for a pharmaceutical company that I actually was able to talk with last night in preparation for this presentation. And so I guess, I don't know, for those reasons, I live in a very different world than where Christina lives. I don't delve so much into the fundamentals, the theories, the kind of the philosophical side of things, and really interesting Supreme Court decisions that kind of are a lot maybe related to kind of your experience in law school, kind of my experience in law school is kind of learning about those things. So I'm coming at this from kind of a fundamentally more kind of practical sort of perspective. One of the things that, as I mentioned, this vice president for safety for a pharmaceutical company that I talked with said that they work on a global level. We live in a world that has all sorts of countries and that have all sorts of different laws, especially as it relates to pharmaceuticals. The perspective of this individual is of a company that is in the pharmaceutical sector, but is working in getting its drugs out to everybody in the world, and especially kind of the first world countries are the ones where there are these thresholds they have to go through. So we've been talking about the FDA, right? Well, there are similar organizations in Europe, Japan, China, other countries, and it was really interesting in talking with this individual. He said that that from his perspective, working for the pharmaceutical company, that actually the FDA, the US FDA, actually makes it relatively easy for them to get these drugs out to people in terms of the right to try and kind of the broader term that he used was kind of expanded access. So in the US, there's expanded access in some different ways, and that also apparently exists in some other in other countries, in other types of programs and things. And kind of his global perspective looking at this was that actually the FDA is one of the better organizations to work with, globally speaking, talking about the different countries, and in terms of making these things available. There are fundamental practical challenges to what we're talking about here that probably are, I don't know if you want to get into this. This is not so much kind of the legal side of things, but more the practical side of things. I have 10 more minutes, and so I'm going to get into that. But I think there's actually kind of a good kind of maybe law school reason to get into this, and that is that sometimes when you're looking at the law, you're looking at kind of the fundamental philosophical rights and perspective and constitution, all these sorts of things. But you know what? These exist and they are applied in the real world, right? And so part of what needs to happen as we look at laws and study them and advocate for change, progress, or whatever we're looking for is how is that going to play in the real world? What is that going to mean for actual people who are in these circumstances? One of the things that I can't remember if this was in law school or shortly after law school that I heard this, that I think this was in law school, that tough cases make tough law. And in the world that I live in, where I'm, for example, lobbying the legislature on on laws having to do with healthcare and stuff, anecdotes are really powerful and persuasive and sometimes really dangerous. And so if you can come up with a particular person that exemplifies what you're talking about, then you can, and especially that's compassionate, and especially that is a very emotional situation, you can really drive the discussion. And that can be really, I don't know, exciting, scary, troublesome, I don't know, choose your adjective. It can do all sorts of different things. And so, I don't know, and that's also kind of my way of apologizing that I don't have some great anecdotes and examples like Christina did. So I'm just kind of blown out of the water on that one. But I'll claim my excuse there. But let me just tell you some of the kind of the practical details here. So in terms of determining safety, as Christina acknowledged, there's not enough time to get into all of the details that could really be helpful to understand in this process. But one of the things that she touched on, but I want to go into a little bit more depth on in terms of the practical reality of how this all works, is the safety issues. Safety is not just kind of a yes-no, it's kind of a range of things. And the process by which pharmaceutical companies go through determining whether or not a particular drug is safe is actually an extended process. Usually it begins with animal trials. They try out the drug in animals, and they get about, and in the animal testing that they do, generally they pick up about 60% of the safety issues that would later be a problem for humans. So right off the bat, and this is part of kind of that 14-year or whatever it is, I mean that's on average, right? Part of the process that takes some time is they try out these new drugs, these new ideas, whatever, in animals, and part of the purpose of that is for safety. And so 60% of the safety problems are found and recognized at that point. Then she mentioned how there's phases of clinical trials. The first phase of clinical trials is fundamentally about safety, and especially, for example, as it relates to cancer drugs, the purpose of that is to figure out what is the maximum tolerated dose, because drugs that are treating cancer often are kind of poisonous to the body, right? But you want to get, how much can the body tolerate, yet that will kill off the cancer, because cancer is actually kind of an abnormal growth of the body, and so it really is a part of the body that you're trying to kill while you're not killing like the rest of the body. So it's really a kind of a tough balancing act. So phase 1 clinical trials are often about figuring out what is the maximum tolerated dose. And they get about another, of the remaining 40% of safety issues for drugs, about another 2/3 of those safety issues are fleshed out in phase 1 trials. And then you go on to phase 2, which is more about efficacy. Another 20% of safety issues come to light then. Phase 3, another 10%. And then additional safety issues come to light post-marketing and so on after that. So it's not really kind of a yes or no, hey, we've been through phase 1, so we know it's safe, and so why don't we just roll it out to everybody? No, there's still really fundamental issues that are being figured out, even as to safety, as it goes through this process. As a matter of fact, part of what she mentioned, I don't know if you caught this in her discussion, but is even after a drug is FDA approved, sometimes there are safety issues that come up later that result in a black box warning or being even taken off the market or whatever because of safety, because sometimes those are issues that don't fully come to light and aren't fully understood until a bunch of years further down the road. So it's really kind of a very complex issue, a complex process. Our bodies are complex, and so to figure out how this is going to work and how bodies are going to respond and how it's going to help people is really challenging. Another kind of practical, fundamental issue, actually a few more here, are that depending on what the company's capacity is, depending on what the drug is like, sometimes it is extraordinarily difficult, time-consuming, and expensive to produce these drugs that we're talking about. And so in order for a drug to be made available to an individual that might potentially benefit from it, the company might not have any of that. They don't, because it's so expensive, because it's so difficult to produce some of these things, they produce what they need in order to go through the clinical trial to figure out if it is going to be safe and effective, and they might not have additional available to give to people for compassionate use or expanded access. It depends on the cycle of where things are. Sometimes they will gear up to kind of produce a certain batch of this drug to go through a certain part of the trial and the investigation and that sort of thing, and then they get and then they kind of go through that, and then they don't have more available until they go through the next phase. And so if somebody in the middle of that is approaching them saying, hey, I might be a candidate for this, I'd like to try it, some of these companies in a lot of these situations are going to be saying, oh, sorry, I don't have any of that available. It's all committed to this trial. And so even whatever you do with the law, it's not going to be available. Another part of the challenge here is about the adverse event stuff. And this is something that I kind of picked up more on in Christina's article. But adverse events are things where are situations where something goes wrong when this is being tried in a person. So if a person, so they do this clinical trial, right? They get a bunch of people together and they say that have this condition, they're going to give them this drug or a placebo. Placebo means something that's not going to be active, to compare and see if this is going to be, if it's going to work, if it's going to be effective, if it's safe, and all those sorts of things. And under those circumstances, you're going to get to a situation where there might be something that goes wrong with that individual, where they might have a heart attack or whatever, right? So that has to be reported and analyzed, and they have to look into that and figure out, is that potentially, possibly related to this drug? Well, it's really hard to tell at first because very few people have taken this drug before, right, in the early stages of the trial, and so they're just gathering this information. So part of what is challenging about what is being talked about here in terms of right to try is that you're giving this drug to a bunch of people outside of the clinical trial, right? That's what we're talking about here, is this compassionate, use, the expanded access, where there isn't the same review, vetting procedure for this person to enter the trial, and then if something happens, they get a heart attack or whatever, something goes wrong, there's an adverse event, that gets reported. And part of what happens internationally is that any adverse events basically have to go into the calculation and be reported to everybody everywhere, not just the FDA. And it's not just, you can't just blame this on the FDA. The FDA is going to hold it against them or whatever. No, this is a part of the scientific process that all of the countries that they ever want to get this drug out to are going to want to know all of the adverse events that happen along the way and what it meant and what were the circumstances. Part of the challenge here is that for the clinical trial people that are going to be getting this, they want people that don't have comorbidities. They don't want to have situations that also people that have other problems, like maybe diabetes, if that might be complicated, or other genetic problems, or whatever else, other issues, other diseases that might confound the information here. Because the thing is, they want somebody who's just a straight up, just this person, this is all that they have, and we need to give them this drug and see if it responds. Because if they have, a heart condition or whatever else, or they're already declining in health, then what happens with that individual and the drug might not be reflective really of the drug. I mean, already it might not be just because of the variations in individuals, but it's going to definitely be more complicated if they also have other issues. And so one of the big challenges for companies and for this whole idea of expanded access and stuff is if you're going to let additional people into this process who might also have, a heart disease and diabetes and whatever else on top of cancer, and maybe they've had cancer for a while and they're in declining health, all of a sudden now, if they have an adverse event, that has to get reported. That goes into all of the information. That goes out to all of the countries that are ever going to be considering whether or not this is going to be marketed in their country. And it's hard to know for sure under those circumstances whether it really fundamentally had to do with this drug or not. But it has to be reported, and so it's a real challenge. There's all these different pieces to it that's really complex. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you about it, and my time's up.
All right, well, let's see if I can get through a couple of these additional points in the limited time we have left. First of all, I want to make clear, these are some very, very good points. Right to try is not a cure-all, and it never purports to be, right? It's true, there are still risks. There are risks to the patients, there are unknown risks. But again, these are things, as I pointed out before, that exist in any context. As we've both discussed, drugs that have been on the market for years, sometimes for decades, are later on flagged for safety concerns. The FDA allows us to take drugs that it knows are extremely risky, right? Chemotherapy is, essentially a poison. That's very risky. Even acetaminophen kills, that's Tylenol, right, that you all take for your headaches, it kills about 300 people a year. So we even allow through our system paid volunteers. We pay healthy people to test out drugs sometimes and determine whether or not those drugs not only are effective, but whether or not they're actually safe. So we allow people to take risks every single day. And outside of the healthcare context, we allow people to do all sorts of risky things. Driving a car is extremely risky, right? People take risks every single day of their lives. This is not, Right to Try is not saying that risks don't exist. It's also not saying that science isn't important. Science is extremely important, and the clinical trial system is extremely important. What Right to Try is saying is that regardless of all of that, every individual owns his or her own life. You have a right to try to save your own life. If you can't make it into a clinical trial, if you can't access a treatment some other way, then you should not have to beg the government to try to save your own life. It's true that some companies might not be able to give you the treatment. They may not even be willing, right? Sometimes companies will say, look, we're still not sure if this treatment is good enough for you, and we don't want to give it to you. Your doctor might not be willing to prescribe it to you. Your doctor might say, there's, it's too many unknowns, and I, as a medical professional, don't feel right prescribing this treatment to you. That's not only okay, but that's good. That's how the system's supposed to work, right? There are multiple people and multiple checkpoints. What we're saying is that the government should not be empowered to stand between a terminally ill patient and a treatment. That's all Right to Try says. Real quick point about the adverse events. That is an issue, and one of the things that the federal Right to Try law addresses really well is the issue of adverse events. See, under the FDA's former compassionate use, so-called compassionate use or expanded access program, where you can essentially beg the FDA for an exception to try treatments outside of a clinical trial, only about 1,000 people per year get access to treatments through expanded access. That is not a lot of people when you figure cancer kills about 500,000 a year. And why is that? Well, there are a number of reasons. There is a lot of bureaucracy involved. There's a lot of paperwork involved with getting access to those treatments. A lot of doctors say that there's not enough time to even be able to administer an expanded access request and program. And that's why Diego, for example, had to go overseas to Europe, because he had to take his treatment right after he got his initial diagnosis, and there wasn't enough time to go through the FDA. Another reason that companies sometimes don't want to use expanded access is because they are afraid. The FDA has never clarified or said what it would do if an adverse event, if a patient experiences an adverse event. Is the FDA going to use that against that company? Will they deny approval of that treatment? Will they hold up approval of that treatment? They've done it before. They don't do it often, and the FDA says that it doesn't do it often, but the FDA has also never clarified what it would do with an adverse event, and that leaves a lot of companies in a very risky situation. Right to Try doesn't fix that for everybody, but what it does say is it says the FDA can't use adverse events against a company to delay or even thwart final approval of a treatment unless there are serious safety concerns. If the FDA finds serious safety concerns, then it can, but otherwise, because as we said, these patients taking these treatments are by their nature very sick and have a lot going on, we want to encourage companies to be able to be philanthropic and give people access to these treatments without having to worry that all of their investors are going to be in a situation where now all of their years and years and years of investment in this product are not going to be able to go toward final approval. And a lot of doctors and scientists and companies have told us that it's actually very helpful to have real-world data outside of clinical trials. That helps companies, that helps scientists, that helps doctors make determinations about these treatments. To conclude, there's a lot going on here, but I think it's really helpful to look back at the history of the FDA here. When the FDA was first created, its mission was to empower patients to make decisions for themselves in conjunction with their doctors, right? The FDA was concerned, of course, with safety, but also concerned to make sure that patients had the information they needed to make these decisions. Because there's a lot of fraud out there, there was a lot of mislabeling, and the FDA was formed to make sure that the information that you got about treatments was as accurate as possible so that you could make your own decisions with your doctor and with your families. Over the years, the FDA has morphed into an organization that has not empowered patients to make their own decisions, but has purported to be the decision maker. The FDA acknowledges that it does not have the authority to regulate the medical profession or the practice of medicine, and yet that's what it does on a de facto basis when it stands between patients and their doctors and their families from making life-saving or potentially life-saving decisions. So the argument with Right to Try is just that, look, We're not throwing science out the window. We're not even throwing the FDA or the regulatory process out the window at all. What we're saying is that when you face a terminal illness, you have enough to deal with. You shouldn't have to beg the government for permission to try to save your own life. So thank you. This is really just more the start of a discussion, I think, than the conclusion of one. I hope we'll have time for some questions. And if any of you want to follow up at all, please feel free to reach out to the Goldwater Institute. We'd love to continue to have the conversation with you. Thank you very much.
So I know some of you guys have class pretty soon. If you do, feel free. Let's grab a couple questions. Do we have any questions out here? Nick?
You touched on this a little bit, but do you think there's any of the functions of the FDA currently performed would maybe be better left just to Congress, maybe for either policy reasons or for people reasons?
Yeah, so the question was, are there any functions of the FDA that would be better left to Congress? Well, you know, it's interesting. Congress has actually empowered the FDA to do a lot of things that it really hasn't taken advantage of. Congress has passed laws that would allow the FDA to work. We talked a lot about international, other countries, that would empower the FDA to work with other countries so that money that is spent on research and clinical trials in other countries could actually be used, that data could be used in the United States, so we have some kind of reciprocal approval process so that companies aren't spending money and resources getting drugs approved in one country and then turning around and doing the same in the other country. The FDA has not used that power at all to its full potential. And so my argument, sort of as a follow-up to Right to Try, is that Congress ought to direct the FDA to do that. Congress ought to direct the FDA. There is a bill out there called the Results Act, which is very good. It essentially says that there's a certain number of EU and other countries that have very similar approval processes to ours, that if a drug is approved there, it would be automatically approved here unless the FDA, within a 30-day window, says that there's some reason why it should go through additional testing. I think Congress should step up and actually force the FDA to be better, more patient-centric rather than risk-averse as it is today.
So I have a question for both of you. So I worked in the Massachusetts State House, and one of the things that we were really concerned with was what's called off-label use, where a medication, let's say it's prescribed by the FDA, it's usually for a specific reason. If the drug is then used for another reason, so like there's an antacid, that's an antacid, but it's also used for acne treatment, but that's an off-label. So are you seeing an overlap between off-label use and Right to Try, especially considering the fact that Right to Try is based on phase 1, it's safe,
Right.
and off-label uses, there's no really scientific data about this in certain age groups and other things like that.
I guess I'll do that one quickly, maybe. All right. So yes, the question, off-label uses is an excellent example here because essentially that's what Right to Try is, right? The idea with off-label use is that something has passed safety testing, but it hasn't passed the efficacy part because we don't know whether it'll work for, or at least we don't know to the FDA's specifications whether it'll work for a particular other disease or problem. Off-label use is extremely, extremely common. 1 in 5 cancer treatments, that number actually might be higher today, but is used off-label. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If it takes 14 years and billions of dollars to go through the FDA approval process, it doesn't make sense to say, well, for cancer A, you go through, you spend all that money, you get that drug approved. Now you've got to go another 14 years and spend all that money getting that drug approved for cancer B and cancer C. The whole point is the FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine. So the FDA says, and recognizes that so long as a drug has been approved for one use and it's gotten through safety testing and it's been all the way approved for final market, doctors can, within their medical judgment, prescribe that treatment off-label. And many of you have probably had treatments prescribed off-label. Again, it's very, very common. One of the things that we're working on now, also as a follow-up to Right to Try, is that an oddity in the law where the FDA allows doctors to treat off-label, but they don't allow pharmaceutical companies to share information about off-label treatments with those doctors unless that information is solicited and very, very specific. So in other words, a pharmaceutical company, the one with most of the information about these treatments, has information that something might work. Say it works for one kind of cancer, it might work to treat another kind of cancer. They can't share that, as they did in the past with doctors, and let them know. And so doctors are either left in the dark about off-label treatments, or maybe they're left in the dark about new side effects associated with off-label treatments, and they may be under or over prescribing off-label. That is bizarre in the world of the law, as you all know, because that's a situation where the conduct is legal, but the speech is illegal. And it's usually the opposite. The First Amendment does not allow the government to outlaw truthful speech or truthful information, and yet that's exactly what the FDA has done and what I would consider to be a gag rule. So that's actually another reform that we're working on at the Goldwater Institute, to say if the treatment is legal, you ought to empower doctors with the information that they need to be able to make prescription decisions for their patients.
I'll just throw in a couple of things that are fundamentally different about the off-label use versus the kind of the right to try side of things, is that on the right to try, it's still a brand new drug that hasn't finished going through even the regular process of vetting for safety. There's still, maybe 30% of the safety aspects that haven't been fully understood yet at that point. And then the availability. The off-label use is for a drug that is actually out there in the market, whereas we're talking about on the right to try, it's a drug that is not yet out on the market. Doctors haven't had experience with it yet in the regular labeled way or even the off-label way. One of the things that's really interesting about off-label is that, as Christina mentioned, there is a lot of use, and so there's kind of a growing body of understanding about off-label use of certain drugs for certain conditions. Yeah, so there's a bunch of things.
We'll grab, grab one. Grab one, last one, and then if you have any more questions, come up.
Okay, yeah, I'm just wondering, it sounded like in the middle of your speech, Ms. Sandefur, that maybe you thought that it's better to maybe get rid of federal regulation and bring it to the states instead. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, no, definitely not. In fact, I think it's very helpful to have uniform regulations, which is why it's really great that right to try is a federal law now, because it makes it very difficult for drug companies to know how to navigate the law. Every single state has a different law. What my argument is that when the federal government fails to protect people's rights, and patient groups have been trying for decades upon decades to try to get reform at the FDA level, have had very little success. It is not only within the power of the states, but the duty of the states, I would argue, to step up and protect the rights of their citizens. And ideally, it works out like right to try did, where enough states step up and do that the federal government now faces a situation where they have to act, because there's so many different states that have acted and they feel like they have to take that issue on. So it's more of a practical way to protect people's rights and not necessarily a preference. I don't think there's any reason why you would favor the states versus the federal government. We favor liberty and we favor the protection of people's rights. And so you do that by any means possible, and that's the system our founding fathers set up, frankly, is to say that if the federal government fails,